4 men confessed to the same murder. Not one of their stories matched. Different timelines, different details, different versions of the crime. But the detective leading the case kept pushing forward, because once someone confesses, people stop asking questions, even when the confession makes no sense, even when the evidence says it can't be true, and even when the man pulling these confessions out of them was, years later, sent to federal prison himself. Norfolk, Virginia, 1997. A Navy town. Quiet streets. People who know their neighbors. Then one apartment became a crime scene. The victim was Michelle Moore-Bosko, 18 years old, a newlywed. Her husband was at sea when she was killed. Detectives believed the killer had to be someone close, someone who knew her, someone in the building. And almost immediately, their attention landed on a young sailor named Danial Williams. He lived directly across the hall. No criminal record, no experience with interrogations, and according to those who knew him, unusually susceptible to pressure. Danial Williams was the first. There would be 3 more. Joseph Dick, Eric Wilson, and Derek Tice. But to understand what happened to all of them, you have to understand what happened to him first. Williams denied everything, repeatedly. He was questioned for 8 hours before the lead detective even entered the room. His name was Robert Glenn Ford, a homicide investigator with a reputation for getting confessions. Williams later described what it was like. Someone getting in your face, calling you a liar, poking you in the chest, and then pivoting. I can help you if you tell me the truth. The threat and false promise delivered by the same person in the same room for 11 hours. Eventually, Williams broke. But here's what matters psychologically. False confessions don't start with a lie. They start with uncertainty. A suspect begins doubting their own memory, their own judgment, their own ability to leave the room. Detectives rejected answers that didn't fit the crime scene. They guided Williams toward details they believed were correct. Slowly, his story began to take shape that wasn't his own. The problem? The confessions still didn't match the evidence. Timelines were wrong. And investigators faced a decision: accept the confession was unreliable or look for someone else to confirm it. They chose the second option. Then the DNA came back. The biological evidence recovered from the crime scene did not match Danial Williams. In a normal investigation, that ends it. This wasn't a normal investigation. Instead of releasing Williams, Detective Ford and prosecutors made a quiet decision. If the DNA didn't match Williams, he must have had an accomplice, so they went looking for one. They picked his Navy roommate, a sailor named Joseph Dick. Dick was interrogated, worn down, threatened with execution, and eventually, he confessed. He did also something else. He named others, because once a suspect breaks, interrogators ask the next obvious question: who else was there? Within months, 2 more sailors were pulled into interrogation rooms. Eric Wilson, Derek Tice. Both confessed. Both later said they did too, so escaped the room. Derek Tice put it in this way: tell him what he wants to hear and live, or keep telling the truth and die. But the new confessions had the same problem as the original. Different doors, different timelines, different versions of the night. Contradictions everywhere. The DNA came back on the new suspects. None of them matched either. Any reasonable prosecutor would have stopped there. They didn't. Instead, they explained their theory again. If 4 sailors didn't match the DNA, they must have been more attackers. They indicted a 5th man, then a 6th, then a 7th, a Navy retiree who lived 300 miles away in Pennsylvania. He had paper recordings proving he wasn't even in Virginia that night. He was indicted anyway. Psychologists call this belief perseverance. When people become emotionally committed to an idea, contradictory evidence no longer changes their minds. It only forces them to create new explanations. 1 sailor became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 7. The crime scene stayed the same size. The list of attackers kept growing. By the time the trial began, the evidence against them was essentially nothing. No DNA matched across any of the 7 men. All had passed polygraph tests. No physical evidence consistent with a group attack. Every defendant had recanted, but the prosecution had a position. Confessions still mattered. And this is one of the most disturbing realities in criminal justice. Human beings trust confessions more than science. Jurors do it, investigators do it, even judges do it, because emotionally, a confession feels undeniable. People think, why would anyone confess to something they didn't do? The answer to that question was sitting in the room in Norfolk for 11 hours in 1997, and it wore the face of Robert Glenn Ford. While the 4 sailors sat in prison, a man named Omar Ballard wrote a letter from his cell. He was serving time for assaulting another woman in the same neighborhood. In the letter, he confessed to murdering Michelle Moore-Bosko. He had no connection to any of the sailors. He had never met them. He insisted he acted alone. Then the DNA came back. Ballard's matched. His, and only his. And this should have ended it. It didn't. Prosecutors simply expanded the theory one more time. Now Omar Ballard was the 5th attacker. The sailors stayed in prison for years because the justice system publicly commits to a narrative. Reversing course becomes psychologically impossible. Admitting the truth would mean admitting the confessions were never reliable, and the possibility was unthinkable. Most people believe they would never falsely confess until they imagine 11 hours in a small room, a detective who won't stop, a threat, a false promise, and the slow collapse of the belief that telling the truth will save you. Derek Tice's choice? Tell him what he wants to hear and live, or tell the truth and die. Was not a moral failure. It was a survival calculation, the kind any human being is capable of making. When investigators stop searching for truth and start searching for confirmation, the room itself becomes the evidence. Detective Robert Glenn Ford built his career on confessions, dozens of them across decades. He retired with commendations. Then in 2010, the same federal system he once represented indicted him. Extortion, lying to federal investigators. 12 and a half years in prison. And it's important to point out, the man who decided when 4 sailors were telling the truth was all along lying himself. The Norfolk Four were eventually pardoned. Conditional pardons in 2009, absolute pardons in 2017. But they already lost years, reputations, marriages, pieces of themselves no government can return. Their stories never matched. The evidence never matched. The DNA never matched. But the confessions were enough. This wasn't justice. This was verdict undone.